title of the talk is From Games to Genes and Back, because I was quite in a dilemma like, about what specific topic to talk about during a school talk, because as Dr. Deepa mentioned, like I have been working on a broad variety of topics, but I wanted to talk about something which would fit with the theme of the school, as well as try to give some kind of like a insight into what kind of work we are doing over here as well. So yeah, to most of you, good afternoon, and I guess that must be after lunch now. So I'll try my best to not make you fall asleep. Let's see how successful I am in that. So as you guys heard that I'm at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Biology in Plön, Germany. So it's in the very north of Germany. It's not hilly or anything at all. It's mostly just flat with lots of lakes around. But so there are almost 300 lakes within this small state, and Plön happens to sit in one of the center of some of the largest lakes in that area. It's a really small, quaint, beautiful little town, and that's where the institute is. And the institute is for evolutionary biology, but it would seem like a weird location. Why is it for evolutionary biology in the middle of nowhere over here? But that's because earlier it was for limnology, so for freshwater ecology studies. And for that, it's a perfect place then for an institute to be. And that's why the institute is located where it is located over here. So I do work across the different scales of organization, all starting from prebiotic reactants all the way to the dynamics of social institutions. But there is a common thread, right, which runs across the scales of organization, and we try to investigate what would that be. So the theme actually that we are interested in is in interactions between levels of organizations, interactions within the levels of organizations, and how that together leads to the amazing complexity that we do see around us now. And that's basically, so there is a core theme to work throughout the projects that we have, and that is about studying these interactions. Now, they could be evolutionary, they could be ecology coming from within the organisms themselves, or the abiotic ecology, which comes from the outside. So it's a mixture of both the processes and how they work across scales. That's what we are focused on. So as I just mentioned, we can focus either on the ecological interactions, whether they are things like mutualistic interactions or antagonistic interactions. And for that, we do make use of the theories coming from population genetics and evolutionary game theory, besides other techniques which come directly from physics, mathematics, or more and more computational techniques and experimental biology, which is being used to then either corroborate our both assumptions and predictions of the theory. Now, a thing that I do want to mention over here is that evolutionary game theory and population genetics, they are not just tools, but they are also research lines in themselves. So we do want to also promote the development in these fields itself. So not always thinking of them as, okay, this is a tool where I use it to understand something else, but what can I do to improve the tool itself? And that's something that we are definitely interested in. And that's one of the places where I want to start actually today's talk, which how do we try to improve these tools basically. And there is an interplay between both evolutionary game theory and population genetics, which I will try to focus on. So starting with a bit of a background for game theory. Well, game theory has been around, well, the thinking of game theory has been around for quite long. But one can say that it was formally written down in the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by Oscar Morgenstern and John von Neumann in 1944. And they exclusively, more or less, focused on human decision-making among rational interacting individuals. So they made a lot of assumptions, as you can see right there. First of all, which could seem a bit counterintuitive. First of all, it was with human decision-making, but at the same time, they assumed they were rational. So we all know that that's a bit of a stretch sometimes, but that's what it was. It was about interacting individuals, making these really mostly economic decisions. And where do we go from that to evolutionary game theory then? Because in evolutionary game theory, we are now trying to put in the ideas of which you have heard of over I guess, the last whole weekend before that, about classical biological evolution. So how does that meet up together with the economic thinking, which was proposed in game theory? Well, as with biological populations, let's start with the population, right? Biological evolution, let's start with the population. Here we have the population of whichever are your favorite organisms, my favorite organisms being these dots. And think of them as having some kind of variation in them. So here we have two different types of dots, red and blue dots. And what's going to happen to this population? That's actually the question that we are interested in. So with all the processes that we are thinking of reproduction, mutation, and selection, the population can go in like these two different states, right? It could stay in kind of this heterogeneous state in which you have these two different types, or the whole population could be of blue types, or the whole population could be of red types. And that's exactly what is shown by this line at the bottom, where these are the possible population states that you have, where if I track just the fraction, say, of only these red guys in the population, that tells me the state of the whole population at any time, right? If the red guys are 0, I know that we are totally on the left side over here, where the whole population consists of blue guys. If the red guys if the frequency is 1, so then we are on the right side over here, where the whole population consists only of the red individuals. And the in between values of X gives me what is the state of the population at any time then. And that's what we are interested in. But how do we get there now? And what does evolutionary game theory have to do with it? Well, let's think about fitness and how do we include that in this kind of analysis. So imagine we do start with a population with a certain composition, and then we have these kind of fitness measure. Now, where the fitness comes from, that's an external question, which we are not going to directly talk about here because that's a whole big thing in itself. But given that, say, the blue individuals have a fitness of, say, 1, and the red individuals have a slightly higher fitness of 1.1, then we know that the direction of selection would be towards the whole population going towards the red equilibrium, which is the X becoming 1, right? And that's what is shown again in this line at the bottom. And here I would like to introduce the fact that selection might not always work in the direction that you think it would go towards. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed is king. So that's what we did see. That, okay, so you do have some kind of an advantage over here, but a corollary to that typically usually is in the darkness. If a person is with a candle, they are the easier target. So that's also something that one needs to consider. And if you do consider that, then we come to some kind of a dynamic fitness landscape. And a particular version of the dynamic fitness landscape in this case is given by frequency dependent selection. So this is what we saw earlier, where the fitness of the blue individuals was 1 and that of the red individuals was 1.1. But imagine as we are moving towards more and more red individuals then, right? So the population is getting dominated by more red individuals in it. And at that state, if the fitnesses change, because if the way to read this could be that on top, what you see, these are the dominant types in the population. So if most of the types in the population were blue, say this was the fitness given by the first column. But as the dominant type in the population reaches, say, becomes red at some threshold, which is perceivable to the individuals, it becomes red, and then the fitnesses change. So this is the fact about frequency dependent fitnesses. So at that point, if the fitnesses change, and in this case, the fitnesses are still lower because maybe there is some cost of being in the red population. But in that situation, the fitness of a blue individual is actually larger than that of a red individual. And then you see that you don't really go to fixation in red, but as you get closer and closer to red, actually selection will drag you back towards being blue. And from the previous case, we already know that if the population was predominantly blue, actually you're going to go towards red. So selection will drive you somewhere in the middle. And that's what we see over here. And basically this is the crux of evolutionary game theory. We try to put these values together in some kind of a matrix and try to understand the dynamics of the system by looking at these numbers. formal way, well, not per se formal, but like a way of understanding what we just, of this exercise that we just went through, was written very nicely by John Maynard Smith in the book, again, Evolution and Theory of Games, which I would say, like, again, the theory of evolutionary, like the ideas of evolutionary game theory were already there like 30 years before this book was published. But as we could say that formally it was written down then by John Maynard Smith, who put it that evolutionary game theory is a way of thinking about evolution at the phenotypic level, where the fitnesses of particular phenotypes depend on their frequencies. So we on top, you can see like what we have is a payoff matrix where we have the entries, and those we can read them off as the fitnesses of those particular phenotypes. And the columns then give you their dependence on the other types in the population. And this is basically like the dogma for evolutionary game theory. But as you can see over here, that they're focusing on the phenotypic level, and that's what we will try to understand. Like, does it have to be always on the phenotypic level? But emphatically, it was made clear that we are not really looking at dynamics, right? Because what we saw that, okay, selection goes on one side, selection goes on the other side. Once we started these two different vertices, but how does it actually move was not talked about. So what we only discussed was, okay, where will the population end up in the long term? So it will be somewhere in the interior, will it be at the vertices? And that's more like of a static argument. But how do we then get to the dynamics of the system? And there are actually different ways in which you can actually implement the dynamics into the system. I'm not going to go into the details of all the different kinds of dynamics which you can have, which of the dynamical systems that you can impose on this kind of framework. But we will focus on the one which closely emulates biological evolution, and that is the replicator dynamics. So I apologize for people who already know about the replicator dynamics before, but let's go through it again once. So how do we get to that? So we are interested exactly again in the frequency of type A. Now I just got rid of the colors because let's go with type A and type B, and that helps us understand this because well, I should have put A and B here actually already, because this would be A, this would be B, and same on top. But yeah, I hope you get the idea. Because what we are interested is in this line, this basically the simplex, which tells us if the population is going to be all A or all B over time. For that, we need to understand what are the fitnesses of these types. And from these payoffs, we can actually derive then the fitnesses. Because what we are interested is in the average fitness of, say, a type A and trying to what will its fitness be, given that it is either in an environment predominated by A or predominated by B in the population. And if we want to get to the average fitnesses, this is simply what we do. We multiply the payoff entries. So this again, oh, this is not good. This is not good. Because I remember, because I changed the payoff entries, the notation for that after I first prepared the talk without the payoff entries, because then this would be A1, A0, and B1 and B0. So instead of A, B, C, D. So the fitnesses of the average fitnesses of the two types are then just the frequencies multiplied by what they are getting within that particular interaction. If the frequency of X, frequency of A is given by X, then the average payoff of a type A is just A1 times X plus A0 times 1 minus X. Because the whole population is constrained and finite, we can convert them easily to frequencies, and that's why the frequency of type B will be just 1 minus X. So A will increase, right, in the population then, if the average fitness is greater than the average population fitness. So if A is performing better than what the average individual in the population is doing, then it will increase in frequency over time. To calculate the average fitness, we do exactly the same thing. We just take the average payoffs of A and average payoffs of B and multiply it by their frequencies in the population at that time. So that's where we get this F bar. And to get to the dynamics now, we know that A can either increase or decrease in the population. So if I have the, can I write down again? FA and FB over time. And then
Chaitanya, if you're writing something, I can't see it.
Yeah, I see that because I was busy writing and then I realized I don't see it either. Okay, I need to make sure that it works. To get to the average, to get to the dynamics of the system, then what I need to do is make sure that I check the difference between FA and F bar. If I substitute the values of you don't see the device, right?
No.
Yeah.
It is disconnected.
Yeah, I think it got disconnected for some reason. I think we are having some issues with the Wi-Fi over here.
Sir, also your video is freezing. Maybe there is some network issue. So can you
There's
just
some
mute your video? Yeah.
Because I think we have construction actually going on.
Okay.
And sometimes they do, things which we don't want.
Sir, okay, if you mute your video, then you can save some bandwidth. Okay.
Can you still hear me now?
Yes, sir. Can you reshare the screen again?
Yeah, I'm trying. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
And you can also see it, right? I hope now.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So what we want is the difference between FA and F bar to be included in the dynamics. Now, if I resubstitute the values of FA and F bar from what we already see and make sure that the solutions are bounded by 0 and 1, right? Because it doesn't make sense to go beyond 0 and 1 as these are the frequencies that we're interested in. What we actually reach is the replicator equation for two types, which simply can be stated as a difference between the average payoffs of the two types, FA and FB. And this is something that we will use, at least in this talk, but the general form, as you can see, is just the difference between the type you're interested in and the difference from the average payoff of the population, actually. So how do we use this now? So I hope some of you can already guess what the dynamics might look like, because the equation at least tells us what are the limits that we can see, right? So the very first thing to understand is that, okay, if FA is always larger than FB, then the change in the frequency of X dot will be positive, right? Because FA will be higher than FB, and then you are always going to be increasing in the population, and the dynamics in this case will lead you towards the right side over here, because the frequency of X increases at every point for every value of X. Also, what you can have is actually coexistence in a way which X increases up to a certain value.
Yeah, I don't know what the axes are in these plots.
Right. So that's what the axes are. So
X dot versus X, is it? Okay.
Exactly. At the bottom there is the frequency of
Okay.
X, and on the y-axis is the change in frequency.
All right. Thank you.
So what we are basically plotting is X dot, so the y against X here. And one can see that at what are the possible dynamics that we are trying to get to. So over here, we can increase, and here the x dot, so the change over time will decrease. And that's why we will reach some kind of an equilibrium in the interior where you can guess what this line is, right? So this line is the one where exactly FA then will be equal to FB.
So this payoff matrix also has negative elements?
Right. So for the example right now, I used it, but all the payoff values can be scaled actually. So if you just add a constant.
I thought they were interpreted as fitness, right? Frequency dependent.
Exactly.
Why is it it can be negative also if it's deleterious. Is that what you're thinking?
No. So these values, I did not think of them as a very particular fitness value in this case. Or maybe I should have, used a different example. But one of the nice properties of the payoff matrix is that the values are invariant. So the dynamics is then actually invariant to the exact values in there. So you can scale the matrix by adding a constant, by multiplying the whole matrix by a constant, or dividing all the values in the matrix by a constant. And the dynamics is invariant to any disturbance, which is done in a constant manner to all values.
Fine.
So even if they are negative, you can add the most minimum value to the whole matrix, and the dynamics will remain the same.
Okay.
But clearly, I mean, for interpretation of negative fitness values, that's not the right example. I agree.
Okay.
So this is a coexistence part, but we can also see that you can have dynamics going in the other direction, in which here actually selection will drive you away from the interior fixed point. But again, we still have a point in the interior where the fitnesses of the two types are exactly the same. And the last plot is basically, this is the line where fitnesses are same no matter what the frequency of X is. So that means this is just a case of neutrality. And this is something that you might be very familiar with actually, because these are just the classical outcomes of a replicator dynamics for two players and two strategies, which you can get dominance, or you can get bistability, as we saw in the pictures before, or we can have coexistence or neutrality, right? So we can have a fixed points in the interior, or fixed points only on the vertices, or fixed points basically everywhere. That's what neutrality was. And this result, or this kind of terminologies can be actually transferred, and this is exactly my point now, to something that you might already be thinking of. So how do we convert this to genes? So you can think of these things as directional selection, where you get dominance of one of the genotypes. You can think of this as overdominance. This particular example of coexistence is overdominance, where you have an intermediate type which has a higher fitness, right? You can think of bistability as a version of underdominance, whereas neutrality is neutrality, where if you think of now, the reason I have put these three different bars over there on top was to represent what we classically also think in population genetics by three different genotypes determined by two alleles at a particular gene. So if you think of the blue and the red ones to be the homozygotes of a biallelic gene, and the intermediate one to be the heterozygote, you can transfer these kind of terminologies across. But it's not just the transferring of the terminology. We'll see how do we get to this basically plurality in both games and genes. Because if you look at this classical selection equation now, it does exist both in discrete and continuous time in Kimura's book. Actually, you can see that we have P giving the frequency of the allele as, say, allele 1, and Q as the frequency of allele 2. And then we have this dynamical equation which tells us what happens to the frequency of Q over time, where W bar is the average fitness. And as I mentioned before, if you think of W0, W1, and W2 as the fitnesses of these genotypes, that's how they were defined. We can transfer this W bar to the left-hand side, which changes the speed of the equation, right? Because you can change the speed of this dynamical equation by multiplying it by W bar on both sides. And then what we end up with is P times Q times this thing in the bracket over here. But since we are talking only about two alleles over here and nothing more than that, so then is that P or Q? Well, they go for Q. So then P is 1 minus Q, right? And substituting that into the above equation then gives us what we see at the bottom, where we have fitness, say, of Q, fitness of P, which is something very similar to what we saw in the earlier slides, right? And this equivalence can then be actually further used to connect the results from population genetics to evolutionary game theory and vice versa. But we do know that genetics can be quite complicated, and the games that I described earlier, they were like totally simple, right? It's like you just have this two interactions between two different types and we get some kind of payoffs, and then we tell what the dynamics looks like. But we do know that genetics is not as straightforward as that. And I would like to give an example of a little bit more complicated scenario than what we just saw with P and Q. And to discuss that, I would like to talk about the MEDEA inheritance system, which is kind of like an interesting system to look at to make our genetic system a bit more complicated. So MEDEA is a naturally occurring selfish genetic element. It was first discovered in Tripodium, but since then has been discovered in many other species, including also mice. And it's, well, the full form of MEDEA is maternal effect dominant embryonic arrest. I'm not sure if they first thought of the acronym and then the expansion of that, or the other way around. But the way it works is that you have these two different genotypes, the M and the plus being the wild type. And the mother, so the female, which you can see on the given by the rows over here, can mate with the males of the different types, M plus, or MM, right? And the reason I focus only on the heterozygote female is because that's where you see the effect of MEDEA. If the heterozygote female mates with a male, which is wild type, so plus homozygote, then they can have 4 different kinds of offspring, right? M plus and plus, which has been shown in the leftmost side of the figure. The female deposits a poison, which in the eggs, which can only be rescued by the M allele. So if the male does not have an M allele, then the wild type offspring have a higher chance of death. So these individuals will die with a certain probability larger than what it would be otherwise in the wild, so without having this MEDEA system. So you can see that if the male is heterozygote, then it can rescue them, but otherwise it doesn't. So basically, in the next generation, the M allele will be seen at a higher frequency than by normal Mendelian segregation. So this super Mendelian inheritance, which is brought about by the maternal effect, is something that makes studying this kind of a system a bit more complicated than what we simply thought of before. That how do we convert our fitness values? How do we get to our fitness idea of the two alleles from here, from this kind of a system? So let's see what kind of, how can we actually convert this to games, right? So in an individual, the chance of getting these alleles comes from 2 different types. So now let's just forget about MEDEA for a moment. Let me go through the logic of how do we actually get to it. So again, let's go back to just 2 simple alleles, big A and small a, as is done in classical population genetic studies. We start with very simple system of 2 alleles, big A and small a. That's what's given on the left-hand side. And we want to, we are interested in trying to find out if we can get to the average fitnesses, say, of these alleles. Now, an allele can find in an individual when you try to get to the mating pattern of two individuals mating and then giving rise to an offspring. the mother has two alleles and the father has two alleles, right? But what are the two different alleles? What are the alleles that they do have? And to get to that question, we need to consider a set of 4 alleles. That means 2 coming from the mother and 2 coming from the father, and all possible combinations, which can be found then in the offspring. Now, this can sound a bit complicated and it might not be very clear. So let me work through an example for this. And that's why you have these colored ones over here, because that's the example that I want to work through. So how do we get to this A1? What does it mean by this A1 over here? So what I'm trying to do over here is that trying to understand what the genotype of the father would be and the genotype of the mother would be. Either way, it doesn't matter which one which. Actually, we do take that into account as well. That if we have differences between mothers and fathers, if the genes coming from mothers or fathers, that can also be incorporated in this kind of a model. So that's A1 is the entity that we want to decipher. And let's make some assumptions about what kind of fitnesses do we have. So the bars over here, they don't really, I don't want to stress that it's over dominance. I just want to say that that's something that could be there, but we don't need to have certain kind of pattern right now in mind. The fact that AA has a fitness of alpha, the big A homozygote, the heterozygote has a fitness of beta, and then the small A homozygote has a fitness of gamma. That's the thing that we are going to be using. Now, if this A that we do see here can pair with this red capital A, and that could be one individual, or the A on the left again can pair with the small green A, or it can also pair with the small blue A, right, to form one individual. And then the other individual would be given by the remaining A's. And this is what I show over here. You can have an individual which has these two alleles, or these two, or these two. And that gives us what the corresponding other individual would be, right? Now, one of them is a male, one of them is a female, and then they mate, and then they form offspring, and they have these kind of fitnesses in between them. And this is what we already see, that the fitnesses, we have already defined them. And then all the individuals over here, for example, would be heterozygotes. Heterozygotes have a fitness of beta, and that's what I've written over here. In the second, in the matrix in the middle, you see that we get a capital A homozygote over here, a small a homozygotes over here, and then we have the heterozygotes on the off diagonal. And the same thing actually on the right side. But since we have three different possible alleles, we have to write them down separately, because there might be a difference between the green A and the blue A, small a's. So if we write down this matrix and calculate what's then the contribution, what's the contribution of this big A allele, because that's what we are interested in, right? The contribution of the big A allele across all these possible combinations. And then we average them, because there are 3 different possibilities that such we can get these, where we can have these kind of different possible combinations. And then we get to the value that it is alpha plus 2 beta over 3. Because we try to look at how many of these possible outcomes is A represented and what's its fitness in those cases then. That gives us the average fitness of A, the capital A over here, when it can have an interaction with the other 3 alleles, which might be one of them is it is associated with itself, and the other 2 forms the other partner. That would give us these kind of payoff entries rather. Now, if we do the same kind of analysis for all possible payoff entries over here, we can fill up this matrix. And now what we get is alpha over in the first, on the leftmost top corner, gamma on the rightmost bottom corner. Again, those are the, as you can obviously see, like, yeah, those are the only offsprings possible, right? Those are the homozygotes, capital A homozygotes, small a homozygotes. We get heterozygotes over here. And in between, we have this slightly complicated way of calculating payoff entries. Now, how do we calculate the average payoff of A allele? in this case and the small a allele in this case. We actually do the same argument. We actually use the same argument as we did for the previous case for the two-player games, but instead now here we have three individuals. Let's say not individuals. Let's not call it individuals, but 3 times we are looking at the frequency of this capital A, right? Now, if we assume that the frequency of a capital A allele in the population is X again, as before, then we could write that as alpha times X cubed, right? Plus whatever we have over here, 2 alpha plus beta by 3 times X squared, 1 minus X, because we have a single A. But we have to multiply this by 3, right? Because there are 3 possible combinations of ways of arranging it. So you get my point, I hope, where this goes on to basically be a binomial sampling with weights, which actually reduces to alpha x plus beta 1 minus x and beta x plus gamma 1 minus x. Because if we simplify all of this for A, and again, we do the same thing for the small a, we actually reach something which is extremely simple. And in retrospect, now if you think about it, we wouldn't have to go through this whole messy calculation, because if we know this is how the payoffs look like, the average payoffs look like, I could just rewrite them in the smaller payoff matrix, which was big A and small a, meeting another in a population which is predominantly made up of big A, or a population which is predominantly made up of small a, right? Because I convert these x's to those frequencies, and then we just get these payoff entries, which tells us again what the dynamics would look like for a two-player game with 2 different strategies, and now the strategies correspond to the alleles. But how do we use this now for MEDEA? So for MEDEA, I've used some of these values as the fitnesses. And actually what we do have is that these plus offspring die with a certain probability t, as I mentioned, because if the mother happens to be heterozygote, that's where we see the effect. Now the payoff entries, I'm not going to go again through the calculation of this, but we can again calculate using this a bit more complicated method. And the reason why we had to use a complicated method and not just a simple 2-player version of it is because if I calculate the average payoffs in this case, they look something like this actually. And if I want to write down a payoff matrix, a simple 2-player payoff matrix using these values, it would look like nu over here, omega, but then here I get 1 minus xt, right? So one of the payoff entries has the frequency already in it. And that was actually one of the beauties of the evolutionary game theoretic approach, that we extract the payoff the extra entries, and make them independent of the frequencies. The frequencies were always going on top for us, and they weren't a part of the payoff entries themselves. Now this becomes a bit more complicated entity, and that's why it's a bit harder to analyze it as a simple 2-player game anymore. And that's the reason we do not go for that, but rather what we have used here is the nonlinearity, which is brought about in the dynamics of the plus allele in a natural way, if we consider this 4-player game. And what I mean by a 4-player game, I'll come to very quickly. But the fact that if I try to reduce it to this simple matrix, so that would be looking for a 2-player game, right? Which reflects the scenario, would make the payoff entries themselves to be frequency dependent. And that is something which we would typically want to avoid, because it leads to complications which cannot be handled very easily. I mean, you can handle it, that's not really a problem, but then it doesn't have the same essence as that of a 2-player game. But what it actually is actually a 4-player game. And what do I mean by a 4-player game now? And this is where I mean, like, we go back to the games part of it, which is about multiplayer games. And we do know that multiplayer games, now zooming out again, like think about social systems, not just genetic systems, but thinking about social systems, we do find these multiplayer games everywhere around us. I mean, there are very few occasions where we do these things in a pairwise manner, but even then one can do them in pairwise manner in a sequential order with multiple individuals. So there are always multiple individuals involved. And how do we understand those dynamics now in a game theoretic sense, right? So what we saw before with this nice payoff matrix was a two-player game where we again track the frequency of, say, one of the types over time. Now, a way of reading, which I mentioned before, was thinking of this payoff matrix as what happens when you are predominantly of, when the population consists predominantly of, say, type A and type B, right? But now let's change our thinking slightly. And the way of reading this would be, these are the two different types, A and B, that we are interested in. And think of the columns as the number of other A players in the population, in your group that you're interacting with, right? And this is why I actually changed the notations for the payoff matrix, because now it is easy to read get rid of this. It's easy to read from the payoff entries themselves why A0 means there are 0 other A players that you're interacting with. A1 means there is one other A player that you're interacting with. And B, the subscript tells you the same thing, but now it's B because these are the payoffs for the B type. And that's what makes it a bit easy to read, because from this, we used, for the typos, which is the classic thing that happens when you copy paste things. So from these, we calculated the payoffs, and then we were interested in the change in A, right? And this was straightforward then.
Chaitanya,
now, if you
question?
Yeah.
So you are, of course, neglecting drift, right? So you have basically infinite number of players, right?
So you have infinitely large number of players, and then you select only 2 at a time, right? But the idea of drift can be included because that depends on the payoff entries, right? So if you have A1, and so if all the entries over here are the same, then there will be no selective advantage of one over the other.
Yeah. Okay.
Because then these values don't mean anything, because then they will be cancelled out by x, 1 minus x. They will be the same as that of over here.
Okay, so I was saying that maybe you're going to multiply these 2-player games or something like that. It's not nothing like that. So that's why I was confused that whether you have infinite number of players or finite.
No, actually, I will come to that. So the population size is assumed to be infinitely large. Yes,
yeah.
And that allows us to talk about frequencies.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So that's the only thing that allows us to talk about frequencies. But when I talk about the interactions, I pick 2 players from this infinitely large population and say that what happens when that individual is of type A and interacts with the other individual who can be of type A or could be of type B.
So I think I still don't understand this dynamic. So that means, let's say the time is discrete. So at one time slice, all the players are, in this case, infinite number. They all will be playing. So it's like a parallel update, meaning like a typically in Wright-Fisher process that all of them are updated. So is that the sort of thinking here also? That means all the 2, one A and one B player will be picked. They will play with each other. Another player will pick another player. All infinite players will play at one instant. Is that how the dynamics are being thought here? Or is it just a single player which is picked?
Actually, that's something pretty interesting, because both using a Wright-Fisher update process, or even if you use a individual-based, like Moran-based update process, it gives the deterministic limit is the same.
Yeah, so because you have continuous time, right? So now I thought I would have just picked one pair because it's a small time. So therefore I should just pick one pair only. But which one are you? It doesn't matter, I guess, right?
It actually doesn't matter. But yes, you can think of that as like, so you pick one player.
Yeah.
as over here. And this one player could be A or B, depending on their frequency, right? That's how you would pick the player from the infinitely large population. And then you update it according to the predominant, according to the population composition. So that's one way of doing it. That then it either increases in frequency in the population or decreases according to its average payoff then.
Right. And if I have a finite population, then again,
So with
similar
finite
fashion, I
population,
pick, yeah.
One can still do it. Yes.
Yeah,
And
same.
So the dynamic equations, yes, we can derive the same thing for a stochastic system as well.
So
where
with
it's
the
not
players,
X,
in a
it's
finite
not
case,
X.
how will you pick the players? Like, will they be picked proportional to their fitnesses, or they are equally likely to be picked up?
No, precisely. So think about it from if I think of from a Moran process, what I would do is I pick an individual according to its fitness for reproduction, and then choose a random individual for death.
So where is that information? So right now, what the information is about the interactions. So where is the information about the fitness of that individual? So this is like AA, no? Like in the payoff matrix, you're saying that the fitness is A when the second player is also A, right?
Yeah.
But when I'm picking, then I need the intrinsic fitness. So where is that information here?
So if the second player is also A, then you get this one. But if the second player happens to be this one, that's B.
I'm sorry, I do not know enough about this, so that's why I'm asking you these questions.
Yeah.
But first of all, I have to pick the player, right? 2 players to pick.
Yes. Yeah.
So now, how do I pick those players? So interaction between the 2 players will be according to your FA and FP. But are these 2 players picked equal probability, or are they picked with their fitnesses? If they're picked with respect to their fitness, then I don't know which information am I using here.
So you do pick them. So I'm really not talking about the stochastic system over here, and that's why I work with. That's why these are the pickings already. But if I do talk about a stochastic system, then you pick an individual. So then we would have a population of size n, and then I of those individuals would be of say type A, and n minus I individuals would be of type B, right? Yeah. And then I pick I over n with probability FA plus n minus I over n minus I minus 1, because we have already picked one individual with a probability of FB.
Okay, I see. So the fitness is FA, FB is what I will see.
Oh, exactly. Okay. All right. But right now we don't need to go through this because we don't have a. If you take n to infinity, then we get x, and then n is infinity 1 minus x.
Okay, fine.
So then we have FA plus 1 minus x FB, and that's what we are dealing with right now.
Thank you.
Right, and that's what goes here. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for asking, because I wanted to avoid but the stochastic derivation of this precisely for this, because there could be different ways of picking, right? You could pick them according to their fitness, or you could pick only the individual to reproduce according to the fitness and then one for death, or you could pick individuals for death according to fitness and the one for birth random. So there are different variations that can be possible there within that.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me see how I can. Is there a way of? Okay. Sorry. Right. Don't know how I can easily get rid of this, but okay. And I was anyways at the end of this, which was like we used these payoffs to get to the replicator dynamics, right? Where we use these FA and FP to understand the dynamics. But what happens when we extend this payoff matrix itself now? So we are still trying to understand what the dynamics looks like for the 2 different types, A and B. But now we don't have just 2 players. So exactly what we went through this picking process before. Thanks, Deepa, for actually asking that because instead of picking just 2 individuals, now instead we say we have to pick D number of individuals, because the game doesn't really take place just between 2 individuals. Because again, we have types A and B given in the population that we want to understand their average payoffs of. But now the other A individuals in your group that you're interacting with now there could be no other A individuals, or there could be D minus 1 other individuals, right? So we have extended now this payoff matrix because now it's not just a two-player interaction, but say a D-player interaction. That's what we are writing down. Now the fitnesses then are just the summations over these binomials, first of all, and then you multiply them with these probabilities that you actually pick an A individual or you have a B individual in your group, and you get your corresponding payoff entries with that. And those are the same fitnesses as that of then A and B as before, because the only difference between those are A's and B's. Those are the payoff entries, where you sum over all possible groupings that you can have. The nice thing about this is we are still interested in what happens to the frequency of A. And since we can calculate FA and FB like this, we can just plug it back into the replicator equation, the same one that we had before. But now the polynomial which we are interested in, which is this FA minus FB, right? That gets pretty complicated because now it's a polynomial of maximum degree D minus 1 minus K, or D minus 1, sorry, because K can be 0. I see there is someone raised hand. Yeah.
Hi, Chaitanya, this is Deepa. I just wanted to point out that there's less than 10 minutes left. So
sure, yeah, I'm almost
finished. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So this is where we have included the complexity of multiple equilibria in the system. So earlier, what we saw over here was we could have these kind of outcomes for a two-player game, right? But for a D-player game, you can have actually very much more interesting outcomes in the system. And this is where I wanted to stop sharing and share my other screen, but I'm not going to do that for the player file because I do have those results already somehow also in this talk, and I just don't want to mess up with the presentation right now, but I can keep it for the discussion later. But for a D-player game, so we can have a much more richer outcomes. And one of the examples for that I will come to. But I just don't want to increase the number of players in this case. But what happens if we do increase the number of strategies as well, right? So we were talking about A and B all the time right now, but what about if there is also C? So the payoff matrix can increase not just horizontally, but it can also increase vertically. And so you can also add A, B, C as the third row. And what happens with all these possible combinations? Now, thinking about it back in terms of genetics, that would mean we can have multiple alleles at the same time in our model. In such a system, we can then calculate that what's the maximum number of fixed points that you would get in the interior. And that's what I was coming to. What are the points in the interior? So here is an example for a 4-player game with 3 number of strategies. So 4-player game means we already have those 3 different strategies on top and 1 on the rows, which exactly is the example that we studied for the alleles. And n is equal to 3. So now think of them not just as 2 alleles, but now if we have 3 alleles actually in that space. We can actually show that for such kind of a system, you can have d minus 1 to the n minus 1 internal fixed points. So of the system, there can be, that's the upper limit that we can get to of this system. So in this system, for example, you can have 9 internal fixed points of the system. And we can show that those are attainable. So it's not just a hypothetical upper limit. But you can also have the maximum fixed points of the system. So what I mean by maximum is that we only talked about the interior fixed points. That's only the interior fixed points, but you can also have fixed points on the edges, right? On the faces over here. And if you include also these ones. So the total number of fixed points could be actually d to the n minus 1 over d minus 1. Now this, we can show that this is the maximum limit which one can get. It's not sure that one can actually reach this limit all the time. And that's something which is, the proof of that is lacking actually, if this upper limit is attainable or not always. But one can show that this is the maximum. Now going back to the genetics with this kind of information now, if you look at some classical texts by Feldman and Carlin, we see that they had actually proposed such kind of a system and the maximum number of equilibria which are possible in such kind of a system, which in 2009, in this paper by Mark Feldman, which was about actually remembering Sam Carlin, he did mention that amazingly to this day, our conjecture that the maximum number of equilibria in any n chromosome viability system and for any recombination arrangement is 2 to the n-1 has not been proven, although there are no counterexamples. Actually, a year after that, Lee Altenberg published a paper in which he came to a proof of this from very hard maths and classical population genetic studies. But if you think of it, in 2 years after that, what we had was this result which showed that it was d to the n-1 over d-1, which for a 2 chromosome system, which is d equals to 2, actually that you get exactly actually what they were looking for. In fact, what we do have, why do we have D and not just 2 in this case, is that D in our case actually would correspond in the population genetic context to actually the ploidy level. Now this, I'm not going to go into detail of how, which is something which you can find in this paper over here. But what we basically have provided is then estimates for the maximum number of equilibria possible in polyploid systems, which was not our initial aim. But this is what happens when we actually start mixing these two terminologies and the concepts which come from different seemingly disparate fields, but which are actually are not, because they're connected by the underlying mathematics so tightly. So this is some of the classical views on what these typical phenotypic, let's say, dynamics might look like, which we have seen over here by now does not need to be limited to the phenotypic values. So what we studied over here or went through over here was just the replicator equation, but that's something that you just get from the replicator mutator equation by neglecting mutations. So for now, we did not talk about anything about mutations, right? But that's something which can definitely be included. And then we get to the replicator mutator equation. But from there, if we again neglect frequency dependent fitness, which is classically done in many cases, then we actually end up with the quasi-species equation. Now, there are these equivalences which go just beyond these kind of dynamics, because you can go all the way from the replicator mutator equation again to the equations of adaptive dynamics. And there are all these equivalences between them, which have been previously explored from the phenotypic point of view. And this is where I want to say that we actually do not need to stick to those domains anymore as well, because we can also extend them to the genetic evolution and back. So the feedback goes both ways. And that's actually the very nice thing about working at this level of interdisciplinarity, or where you keep on interacting with people from different backgrounds. So you see that some places where you can find the ideas of similarity. So this is basically the case of plurality, which I wanted to make in the field of theoretical biology, and especially in the techniques that we use, that a broad strategy coming from diverse fields, it actually enriches both the approaches themselves. For example, I did not talk about how much evolutionary game theory has actually gained from the ideas of recombination, for example, which has been ported into evolutionary games, where we connect that to the ideas of mixed strategies. And it can speed up the progress in one field by the ideas and methods which can be ported from another. But there is also a very important caveat which needs to be mentioned here, that interpretation is key. It is paramount, as assumptions may get lost in translation, and we need to be very aware of what assumptions are being made when stating the equations, for example, in one field, and when we carry them over, are we making sure that we are also carrying over the assumptions, and what do the assumptions mean in the different field then? And I think that's something that we need to be aware of just while doing it, but that shouldn't be the thing that stops us from doing it then. So thanks a lot for your attention, and to my numerous collaborators and wonderful and fantastic colleagues which I've had within the group and across the different countries that I thankfully happen to work with. And yeah, all thanks to the funding agencies as well. And most importantly, thanks to you for having me over here, both to Kavita and Deepa for hosting this wonderful school, which I have been looking at from afar.
Oh,
all
we
the Slack
lost you.
discussions,
Huh.
all the Slack discussions that have been going on. So yeah, thanks a lot. And I'd be happy to have any more discussions or questions.
Okay, are there any questions from Kavita?
Yeah, I just have one question. So from what I understand, basically you the sort of models that you have is single locus models, I would call, in genetics, right?
Yeah.
Is that the correct thing? So, but do people also think of, because, you know, it matters a lot because you mentioned recombination as well. So you need at least 2 loci. So do
Yeah.
people, you know, think of large number of loci in these games context, or like, can you just
Actually,
give me
yes,
some
because
more?
right. So each locus, one can think of each locus as a strategy instead of, like, if you have a combination of A1, B1, that becomes one strategy by itself, because then you just basically increase the strategy space.
I see.
So that
So the
would be one.
strategies are okay. Achha,
Yeah.
I
So
see.
any way of
So
defining an individual.
actually, the individuals, so interaction between the individuals will give you how many players are playing, and you're saying the loci are like the number of strategies. Is that the sort of roughly correspondence?
Exactly.
Achha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So the way of defining an individual would correspond to the strategy then. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how hard or easy, I mean, it's a general question, to include drift in these problems? Because that's
So
certainly
actually,
very, very interesting and very relevant.
so no, that definitely is a case. I mean, the thing is, like, the reason because I focused on the replicator equation, which takes into account selection. So if you think of this x dot equals what we talked about today plus a drift term, then one can extend it, which then adds to the
No, but
which then leads to this.
I mean, if there's no, so I don't have to go to for games, right? I can just start it off as the replicator equation with some noise. But the thing is that the selection is frequency dependent, right? So which makes things difficult because we're non-linear and there are all these other, various different fixed points, or maybe not. So I'm just wondering, like, what's the sort of progress with the drift in this evolutionary game theory? Is it very at an infancy, or do you think there has been sufficient progress? I mean, I'm not very aware of this literature. So if you can just say in a few words, what's the status?
So one of the interesting applications of including drift actually in the replicator dynamics has been in studying systems under co-evolution. So if you have 2 population models, and then you add drift, how long does it take for one to get out of a co-evolutionary cycle, for example? So people have used these to understand models of predator-prey dynamics in a way, because you can have predator-prey cyclic dynamics going on, but then if you add drift to those systems, then you can add the possibilities of extinction or fixation of the other type, then, which is also included. And then people have tried to understand how long does it take for such a system to go to extinction. So one can try to look at properties of such as fixation probabilities and fixation times, then in those kind of systems by including drift.
These kind of questions are also addressed within the framework of game theory. Is that right?
Exactly. So I think the questions which were asked before about the stochastic versions, which I did not go to at all. Because once you go to the stochastic systems, things get actually quite interesting as well, because you can exactly ask these questions about fixation probabilities, fixation times, conditional fixation times, and do all of that analysis, but from the point of view of games, which in my opinion, I mean, it's just a framework to choose to get to similar quantities.
Okay. Okay, fine. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Anybody else? All right, if not, we will close. Agora, yeah.
Yes. So I have a bit of it's a question about that upper bound you gave on the number of fixed points. And you said it's already been proved for, there was a 2 power n minus 1 somewhere in there. And the general form for D, you said was D power n minus 1 divided by D minus 1. And I mean, this is naive, but that looks like, the sum of a geometric series. So, and is there an interpretation that helps is that one interpretation that helps in proving that? Did that feature at all in the proof of the 2 power n case?
Actually, no, because that came from the study of just the polynomials that we did see. but I haven't looked at it from a statistical point of view. So actually, no. So there is work by Mark Broom on this, which again goes in the same direction by looking at the polynomials, but not. I have to think of this. I did not think of it if it connects to some statistical properties of this system rather than dynamical.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I like the talk. Talk's great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Chaitanya. This is very different from what we've sort of heard so far in the school, so it was good to get introduced to a lot of game theory.
Okay, thank you. I was worried.
Yeah. So thank you. And if people think of questions later, please do put in the Slack, and Chaitanya can maybe answer them later. Bye.
Yes, I will.
Bye.
So we'll come back at 4:30 for Guillaume's talk next.
Have a nice school. Bye.